60s. And at this point, it's narrated by a girl called Sue Trinder, who's grown up as an orphan in a kind of thieves' kitchen in the borough in Lant Street. She's been raised by foster parents, I suppose, Mr. Ibbs, who's a fence, and Mrs. Saxby, who's a baby farmer. And Sue is here describing how they dealt at Lant Street with stolen goods, or what they call poke. Good coins we kept, of course. Bad ones come up too bright and must be slummed with blacking and grease before you pass them on. Silks and linens, there are ways of washing and pressing to make them seem new. Gems I would shine with ordinary vinegar. Silver plate we ate our suppers off, but only the once because of the crests and stampings, and when we'd finished, Mr. Ibbs would take the cups and bowls and melt them into bars. He did the same with gold and pewter. He never took chances, that's what made him so good. Everything that came into our kitchen looking like one sort of thing was made to leave it again looking quite another. And though it had come in the front way, the shop way, the Lant Street way, it left by another way too. It left by the back. There was no street there. What there was a little covered passage in a small dark court. You might stand in that and think yourself baffled. There was a path, however, if you knew how to look. It took you to an alley, and that met a winding black lane which ran to the arches of the railway line. And from one of those arches led another, darker lane that would take you, very quick and inconspicuous, to the river. We knew 2 or 3 men who kept boats there. All along that crooked way, indeed, lived pals of ours. We could send poke from our kitchen through any of them to all the parts of London. We could pass anything at all, at speeds which would astonish you. We could pass ice in August before a quarter of the block should have had a chance to turn to water. We could pass sunshine in summer. Mr. Ibbs would find a buyer for it. In short, there was not much that was brought to our house that was not moved out of it again, rather sharpish. There was only one thing, in fact, that had come and got stuck, one thing that had somehow withstood the tremendous pull of that passage of poke, one thing that Mr. Ibbs and Mrs. Saxby seemed never to think to put a price to. I mean, of course, me. I had my mother to thank for that. Her story was a tragic one. She'd come to Lant Street on a certain night in 1844. She'd come, very large, dear girl, with you, Mrs. Saxby said, by which, until I learned better, I took it to mean that my mother had brought me perhaps tucked in a pocket behind her skirt or sewn into the lining of her coat. For I knew she was a thief. What a thief, Mrs. Saxby would say, so bold and handsome. Was she, Mrs. Saxby, I'd ask, was she fair? Fairer than you, she'd answer, but sharp like you about the face, and thin as paper. We put her upstairs. No one knew she was here save me and Mr. Ibbs, for she was wanted, she said, by the police of 4 divisions, and if they got her, she'd swing. I know she was hard as a nut, for she had you, Sue, and I swear she never murmured, never called out once. She only looked at you and put a kiss on your little head. Then she gave me £6 for the keeping of you, all of it in sovereigns, and all of them good. She said she had one last job to do that would make her fortune. She meant to come back for you when her way was clear. So Mrs. Saxby told it, and every time, though her voice would start off steady, it would end up trembling, and her eyes would fill with tears. For she'd waited for my mother, and my mother hadn't come. What came instead was awful news. The job that was meant to make her fortune had gone badly. A man had been killed trying to save his plate. It was my mother's knife that killed him. Her own pal peached on her. The police caught up with her at last. She was a month in prison, then they hanged her. They hanged her, as they did murderesses then, on the roof of the Horsemonger Lane jail. Mrs. Saxby stood and watched the drop from the window of the room that I was born in. You got a marvellous view of it from there, the best view in South London, everybody said. People were prepared to pay very handsomely for a spot at that window on hanging days. And though some girls shrieked when the trap went rattling down, I never did. I never once shuddered or winked. That's Susan Trinder, someone might whisper then. Her mother was hanged as a murderess. Ain't she brave? Stop it there. Thank you.